What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about a film that's getting a lot of hate online, and that film is called The Electric State. Directed by the Russo brothers and written by Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, this film stars an all-star cast of people like Pratt, Millie Bobby Brown, Woody Harrelson, Anthony Mackie, Quan, and many more. And before we get too far into this video, if you guys are a fan of up-to-date reviews like this, early reviews, live streams, and the occasional vlog, then you're in the right place, and I'd like to ask you to consider subscribing. But if you're a returning viewer, well, thanks so much for coming back once again. And today, like I already mentioned, we're talking about The Electric State, which comes from directors Anthony Russo and Joe Russo, the Russo brothers, who of course did the last two Avengers films, and they're very widely praised for their Marvel work in general, including things like Civil War and Winter Soldier, which was their first film for Marvel. And they actually team up once again with the writers of Infinity War and Endgame, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, and this is based on a book by Simon Stålenhag. And with full transparency, I've never read that book. I have no idea what this was going into it. I just saw the trailer and thought, okay, cool, it's a pretty solid team behind this film, and you have an all-star cast of people that I already mentioned, and we'll get a little bit more into that and some of the other big names that are in this movie. But if you go online, you'll see there's so much hate for this film going on right now. Whether you go on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and specifically Letterboxd, the reviews for this film are all over the place, but most notably in the negative department. And it was really interesting to kind of see all that kind of starting to roll out. Even before the film came out, when early critics got to check it out, the Rotten Tomatoes score was super low, and I was really surprised to see that. But one of the main things people are talking about when it comes down to this film is its incredibly just egregious, ginormous budget of over $300 million. I think the reports I saw online were estimated at $320 million, which is insane for a streaming movie. And quite frankly, I tend to stay away from a lot of streaming movies these days. I feel like there's just an overabundance of streaming movies that are coming out on every platform. And a lot of times the quality is hit or miss. You never really know. So unless it's something that really calls to me or it's part of a franchise I'm already connected to, I tend to kind of stay away from a lot of streaming movies. But because of the people that were involved in this film, both on camera and behind the camera, I knew I needed to check this film out, especially when there was so much buzz around it. So with all that said, before we get into my thoughts on the movie and whether or not this movie is really that bad, let's talk about what this movie is all about first. The Electric State takes us back to the 90s and kind of puts us in a retro future world. We get a bunch of exposition at the very beginning of the film to learn that the humans created robots that they used for service industry jobs, different things like that. Your traditional story about robots being made to help humanity, only for them to eventually no longer want to do those jobs and have a bit of an uprising, which led to a human-robot war. Then the movie pops us into 1994, where we spend most of our time with our main character, Michelle, played by Millie Bobby Brown. She's in a foster home with this foster parent guy who doesn't really care too much for her, and we immediately learn that the world is very different. After the war, the world has kind of gone to shit, and now humans are really just kind of living in VR, if you will. It's very similar to something like Ready Player One. A lot of people are using these VR headsets throughout the world to go around in robotic bodies that are controlled by humans instead of having robots in the world. And we learn that Michelle, played by Millie Bobby Brown, unfortunately lost her family, her mother, her father, and most notably her brother, Christopher, in a car accident. But one night she ends up getting a visitor from some little robot that of course she's initially afraid of after the war, only for this robot to tell her that he is her late brother and that he needs her help. So after a little bit of convincing, she goes off on an adventure with this robot that she believes to be her brother to go and try to find where her real brother is, who's out there controlling this robot. Along the way, she ends up making friends with Pratt and the character of Keats and his little robot companion Herman, played by Anthony Mackie, and they end up coming across a slew of big name actors in robot form and in human form, and there are some bad guys in the mix that want to stop them as time goes on. And like a lot of films that have to do with robot human war and segregation and different things like that, this film very much takes a familiar note out of many movies where we have a big robot uprising at the end and humans starting to see that there is some life behind these AI individuals. And that's the general gist of the film without getting too far into everything that happens in this film. What I'll start this off by saying is that I think this film is getting way too much hate. With that said, I don't know that I necessarily think I love this film either. This is a film that I saw earlier in the day. I took a nap and I've gone and had dinner and everything like that. I wanted to sit on the film before I sat down to film a review for it. And what I can say about the film is it leaves me wondering, where is the $320 million budget? On one hand, I could say it's the cast for sure. Chris Pratt, Millie Bobby Brown, Quan, Woody Harrelson, Stanley Tucci, Giancarlo Esposito. These are just some of the actors that are some of the big names in the film that have majority of the screen time. But outside of them, you also have people like Jenny Slate, Coleman Domingo, Brian Cox, Holly Hunter, Alan Tudyk. I mean, the names are jam-packed in this film, and a lot of those are really small roles. Some of them are only in one scene, like Coleman Domingo, who's literally in one scene of this film and has nothing else to do in this movie. And so while you do have a star-studded cast at the front of the cast, you also have a film that's just jam-packed with a bunch of huge names that are ultimately relegated to nothing but cameos, and I'm sure a lot of that went to the budget. Outside of that, this is also a very VFX heavy film, as you have robots everywhere, and I've always been an advocate for films with VFX that are a little bit more cartoony as long as it fits the tone of the film, and for me, that was something I was able to forgive here. The film overall has a really grounded kind of post-apocalyptic kind of, darker look to some of the world that we're in. It's not meant to look all polished and clean, but it still has like a vibrancy to it. It's by no means like a really dark, grungy film, but it's got a little bit of a darker tone to the way that the characters look in the film, because it's supposed to feel like this war happened and, kind of things are in the shit right now. And so when it comes down to the aesthetic of the robots, I enjoyed them. There is a touch of cartooniness. There are a couple of sequences where some of these robots look a little bit more cartoony than in other sequences, but for the most part, I enjoyed the VFX of the film. I thought that the characters were fun to look at, which lent itself to some fun action throughout the course of the film, especially at the very end of the film. And I think for the most part, the VFX kind of blend well with the live action elements, and it all kind of fits within the tone of the film. But with that said, with a budget of $320 million, you would almost expect the CGI of this film to be absolutely flawless, almost lifelike, and that's just not what they were going for here. So again, it does kind of beg the question, where did that budget go to? Because outside of the big VFX elements and the ginormous cast, this is a film that narratively felt safe. I'll say this flat out, I enjoyed the film. I didn't find it to be as bad as other people have found it to be. There was plenty of entertaining elements. I thought that the characters were enjoyable enough. There are some nice charming moments to the film, some fun action, and some humor that worked from time to time. But ultimately, when it comes down to the script, this is a movie that makes me beg the question of, why was this a movie that you would want to invest so much money into, with a story that ultimately feels familiar from other films that have to do with human-robot relations, and ultimately a story that feels pretty predictable and generic. There isn't really an abundance here narratively or on a character level that you haven't seen before, and there's nothing here that really gives all of these big name cast members a lot to do that really elevates the material to the next level. I think when you look at your main stars in the film, Chris Pratt, Millie Bobby Brown, I thought that they were really fun. I enjoyed them in the film. I thought that they brought something to the movie that was likable, but nothing that they haven't done before. I don't by any means think this is a top tier Chris Pratt performance or Millie Bobby Brown performance, and I would say the same for the rest of the cast. Woody Harrelson is enjoyable in this film as Mr. Peanut, which must have been a really interesting sponsorship and product placement in this film to kind of set up behind the scenes. Anthony Mackie is fun in this film as Herman the robot, Chris Pratt's little robot friend. And I think the rest of the cast is pretty solid here as well, in their small and very brief and very, kind of throwaway roles. But nobody here is really great. And I think that's really more has to do with the script and less so to do with the actors themselves. Giancarlo Esposito plays one of the main villains of the film alongside Stanley Tucci, and neither one of them is really stepping out of their box. This is pretty much what you would expect from them playing the bad guy in a film where they're just given a bad guy role, which unfortunately just made majority of the film feel very generic and very predictable. Is it as bad as people say it is? In my opinion, no, but I do think it's worth mentioning that it's a film that could have been better. It's a film that has an interesting yet familiar premise, but it never really took it to that next level. And when it comes down to the core of the story, which is a brother-sister storyline about Millie Bobby Brown trying to find her real brother while dealing with this robot who says that it is her brother, and says that the real body is out there that's controlling this robot. I thought that there was some charm there. I thought there was an interesting, cute brother-sister dynamic in the film. That was probably the thing I enjoyed the most, and some of the moments that I found myself the most emotionally connected to the story. But ultimately, by the time we got to the end of the film, what I could really say I took away from the film is that it has something to say about our connection to, technology, and how it is kind of disconnecting us from reality. But again, this is a film that touches on familiar things that we've seen in much better films, that ultimately begs the question of why this film was made and why this film was made for such a high budget when we already have films that touch on these same things but substantially better. And it just kind of left this film feeling like another one in the mix that just never really had that next level pull. With all that said though, I really don't think this is as bad as people are saying. I think that there's plenty of fun to be had here. I think this is just a perfectly enjoyable enough film to throw on Netflix. I've seen some people giving this half stars, 1 stars, 1.5s on Letterboxd, and I just can't agree. I think there's substantially worse films that you could spend your time watching on Netflix and just in general. I think about some of the movies I cover for this channel that are just absolute dog shit, and when it comes down to this movie, I was never bored while watching it. I enjoyed myself while watching it, despite the fact that I thought the narrative could have been better, despite the fact that some of the humor kind of fell flat for me. Ultimately, it was enjoyable enough. But I think it's one of those situations where, because the Russo brothers and the writers behind this film have done such top tier work with previous Marvel films that have been some of the people's favorite films of all time, it does beg the question, do you give these kind of filmmakers a pass on a film that feels so lackluster with such a high budget when you know what they're capable of in the past? I think for something like this, I can give them a pass. It seems like there was some creative missteps behind the scenes that ultimately led to this film feeling over bloated in its budget, that ultimately led to this being like something that they thought would be a lot cooler than it actually was. And I hope that they learn from the criticisms here, especially as they move forward with the new Avengers films that they're going to be doing for Marvel. I think that they definitely still have some great creative talent under their belt. I think there's definitely some interesting elements about this film. I just think it ultimately could have been better, and that's really my biggest takeaway from this film. Not a bad film, not terrible by any stretch of the imagination in my eyes, but ultimately something that could have been better. But there's definitely things to enjoy in this film, and while I don't think this film is going to be on anybody's top 10 of the year list by the time we get to the end of the year, I think there's certainly things you can walk away from this film and go, man, I could have seen worse. That was definitely an enjoyable enough time. And I'm really surprised by how some people are really hating on this film. Like, I'm actually surprised, and maybe that's why I'm a little bit more positive on it here. It's like I was expecting to walk in and watch this complete like dog shit movie, and ultimately it just was not that. It just was enjoyable enough, just not on the same level that we've seen from these creators in the past. So with all that said, that's going to be my thoughts on The Electric State, and I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Where do you land on this film? Do you think people are right and that this is just as bad as people are saying? And why do you think so if you do? Is it because of how big the budget is and who's creating this film that you kind of hold them to a higher standard? Or did this movie just kind of come out flat out terrible to you? Or are you like me and think the film is not that bad, maybe not the greatest thing in the world, but enjoyable enough? I look forward to hearing all the various opinions. I'm sure with a movie like this, there's going to be a lot of divisive takes, so try to be as respectful as you can down below. I look forward to hearing what everybody has to say, whether we agree or disagree. But whatever the case may be, hit that like button if you guys enjoyed this video, comment your thoughts, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.